Some criminals are caught instantly, but others, they slip through the cracks, vanishing before justice can catch up. These are the chilling stories of those who got away, but only for a while. Let's dive in. They say the most dangerous criminals are often the ones you'd least expect. In 1980, Glenn Stewart Godwin was just another young businessman in Palm Springs, California, a self-employed tool salesman with no criminal record and, by all accounts, a normal life. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked something far more sinister. Within just a few years, this seemingly average man would transform into one of America's most wanted fugitives, leaving a trail of violence, murder, and daring prison escapes across 2 countries. What turns a law-abiding citizen into a cold-blooded killer? And how does someone manage to escape not just 1 maximum security prison, but 2? Well, before we dive into those questions, we need to go back to where it all began, to understand how a simple business dispute spiraled into one of the FBI's most notorious manhunts. Glenn Stewart Godwin's story starts in Miami, Florida, where he was born on June 26, 1958. Like many American families in the 1960s, the Godwins moved west seeking better opportunities, eventually settling in Palm Springs, California. Young Glenn seemed to excel in school, even playing trumpet in the brass band. There were no red flags, no warning signs of the violence to come. He was just another kid growing up in the sunshine of Southern California. By 1980, at age 22, Godwin had established himself as a hard-working young entrepreneur. He ran his own tool sales business while also working as a mechanic and construction worker. He shared a condo with his roommate, Frank Soto Jr., and appeared to be living the American dream. But sometimes, the dream can turn into a nightmare faster than anyone expects. That nightmare began with a plan that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Godwin and his roommate Soto had their sights set on Kim Robert LaValle, a local drug dealer and pilot who had once been their friend. What started as a simple robbery scheme would soon reveal the darkness lurking behind Godwin's ordinary facade. On a hot summer night in 1980, Godwin and Soto put their plan into motion. They lured LaValle back to their condominium, but what happened next went far beyond a simple robbery. While Soto held their former friend, Godwin unleashed a level of violence that shocked even his accomplice. He didn't just want to steal from LaValle, he wanted to destroy him. Godwin began by punching and kicking LaValle, then attempted to strangle him. But that wasn't enough. In a frenzy of violence that would later haunt investigators, Godwin grabbed a knife and stabbed LaValle 26 times. Even then, the horror wasn't over. Godwin and Soto loaded LaValle's body into a truck and drove out into the desert, where Godwin revealed the next phase of his plan, one that showed a frightening level of premeditation. He had prepared homemade explosives, strapping them to LaValle's body in an attempt to obliterate any evidence of the murder. On August 3, 1980, residents of Eagle Mountain made a grim discovery, a blown-up pickup truck with human remains inside. But Godwin's attempt to cover his tracks would ultimately fail. Police identified the remains as LaValle's, and the investigation quickly led them to Godwin and Soto. During the trial, Soto turned against his former roommate, testifying about that brutal night. His words would send chills down the spines of everyone in the courtroom. He described Godwin as the most dangerous man I have ever met. This wasn't just a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was a calculated act of savage violence. In 1983, the court sentenced Godwin to 26 years to life in prison for murder and robbery. Soto, despite his cooperation, received 25 years to life. It seemed justice had been served and the story of Glenn Godwin should have ended there, locked away in a California prison cell. But for someone like Godwin, prison walls were just another challenge to overcome. His first stop was the Dual Vocational Institute in Tracy, California. It didn't take long for Godwin to show his true colors. He attempted to escape. This failed attempt led to his transfer to the infamous Folsom State Prison, a maximum security facility known for housing California's most dangerous criminals. But even Folsom's formidable walls couldn't contain Glenn Godwin's determination to be free. What happened next would cement Godwin's place in criminal history and eventually land him on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. But the story of his incredible escape, and the even more incredible events that followed, well, that's coming up next. While most prisoners dream of escape, few have the intelligence, resources, and sheer audacity to actually pull it off. But Glenn Godwin wasn't like most prisoners. From the moment he arrived at Folsom State Prison, he was already plotting his way out. And he had help, not just from the outside, but from within the prison's own systems. In a move that showed his calculating nature, Godwin managed to manipulate his way into a less secure area of the prison. He convinced another inmate to tamper with his security designation, dropping him from maximum A housing to a lower security level. This got him assigned to work detail in an older section of the prison, where oversight was more relaxed. But this was just the beginning of an escape plan worthy of a Hollywood movie. On the outside, two key players were working to aid his escape. His wife, Shelley Rose Godwin, whom he had married while incarcerated in 1985, and his former cellmate from Duel, Lawrence Carlick. Together, they would help orchestrate one of the most daring prison breaks in Folsom's 124-year history. On June 5, 1987, everything was in place. Someone, likely Carlick, had already cut through the bars of a storm drain from the outside. Tools had been smuggled into the prison, including a hacksaw that Godwin would use to cut through the fence wire. But the most incredible part? The escape route itself. Godwin dropped through a manhole and crawled 750 feet through a pitch-black storm drain that emptied into the American River. Just imagine it, crawling through complete darkness, knowing that one wrong turn could mean discovery or death. But Godwin had planned for everything. When he emerged from the drain, a raft was waiting for him, left there by his accomplices. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. As Godwin floated down the American River, he followed a series of painted arrows on rocks that guided his way to freedom. He ditched his prison clothes and disappeared into the night, becoming only the third person to successfully escape Folsom in 25 years. The escape sent shockwaves through the California prison system. How could someone orchestrate such an elaborate plan right under the noses of prison officials? The investigation quickly focused on Godwin's accomplices. Lawrence Carlick was arrested in Hesperia, California, and convicted for his role in the escape. But his story would end tragically. In 2002, Carlick died by suicide in Los Angeles County Jail, taking many of the escape's secrets with him. Meanwhile, Shelley Godwin had vanished. In January 1988, she was classified as a federal fugitive for her role in her husband's escape. But she had a few tricks of her own. While authorities searched for her, she quietly divorced Glenn, remarried, and started a new life in Texas. It wasn't until February 7, 1990, when an episode of America's Most Wanted aired about the case, that the FBI finally caught up with her in Dallas. But what about Glenn Godwin himself? While authorities searched for him in California, he had already crossed the border into Mexico, where he would write the next chapter of his criminal saga, one that would prove even more shocking than the first. Godwin didn't lay low in Mexico. Instead, he dove headfirst into the dangerous world of drug trafficking. But his luck ran out in Puerto Vallarta, where Mexican authorities arrested him on drugs and weapons charges. He was convicted in Guadalajara and sentenced to 7.5 years in Puente Grande prison. This should have been the end of the story. U.S. authorities were already working on extradition proceedings to bring him back to California. But Godwin had other plans. While in the Mexican prison, he allegedly murdered a member of a drug cartel, a move that would delay his extradition. But was this just another calculated step in Godwin's master plan? Just when authorities thought they finally had Glenn Godwin contained, he pulled off the impossible again. In September 1991, less than a year after entering Puente Grande prison, Godwin vanished. He had become one of the few criminals in history to escape from maximum security prisons in 2 different countries. The details of this second escape remain shrouded in mystery. As FBI Special Agent Dan Rodriguez explained in a later interview, "We didn't get any detailed account from the Mexican prison. But investigators have a theory about how he pulled it off. They believe Godwin's murder of the cartel member wasn't just random violence. It was a calculated move to gain powerful allies. What we have kind of speculated," Rodriguez said. was that he was able to make some cartel friends down there. So in exchange for committing a murder within the Mexican penitentiary, they would assist him with an escape out of that prison. This theory paints a chilling picture of Godwin's cunning. He didn't just take a life, he used murder as a bargaining chip to buy his freedom. It was a move that showed just how far he was willing to go to avoid returning to California's prison system. On December 7, 1996, Glenn Stewart Godwin's face appeared on one of the most infamous lists in law enforcement, the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. He became the 447th person added to the list since its creation in 1950. His addition made history in another way, too. His photo was the first color image ever used on the list. The FBI's profile painted a picture of a highly dangerous and adaptable criminal. They noted Godwin's fluency in Spanish and his suspected involvement in drug trafficking throughout Latin America. His known aliases read like an international cast of characters: Dennis Harold McWilliams, Nigel Lopez, Miguel Carrera. Each name represented another layer of deception, another way to stay one step ahead of justice. In 1997, there was a reported sighting of Godwin in California, but he managed to slip away before authorities could close in. Since then, the trail has gone cold. The FBI believes he may be involved in drug distribution somewhere in Latin America, using his language skills and charisma to blend into local communities. The reward for information leading to Godwin's capture stands at $100,000. But as the years passed, the FBI began to question whether keeping him on the most wanted list was still effective. In May 2016, after nearly 20 years, they removed Godwin from the list. As the FBI director explained, "We think the payoff from the publicity has diminished over time. But this doesn't mean they've given up the hunt. Tips continue to come in, and each one is thoroughly investigated. The FBI considers Godwin armed and extremely dangerous, and an obvious flight risk. After all, this is a man who turned from a successful businessman into a brutal murderer, and then engineered not one, but two dramatic prison breaks." Today, Glenn Stewart Godwin would be in his mid-60s. The FBI believes he takes pride in his appearance and likely maintains the same meticulous attention to his physical fitness that he showed in his younger years. But beneath whatever facade he's created lies the same calculating mind that orchestrated multiple escapes and showed no hesitation in taking lives to achieve his goals. His case remains one of the most fascinating in FBI history, a testament to how a seemingly ordinary person can harbor extraordinary capacity for both violence and cunning. From a clean-cut businessman in Palm Springs to an international fugitive, Godwin's transformation reads like a Hollywood script. But for the families of his victims, and for the law enforcement officers who continue to search for him, this is no movie. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who appear the most normal. Next, another shocking case of someone who nearly escaped justice. Let's dive in. They say the perfect crime doesn't exist. But what if I told you about a man who walked out of a bank with $215,000 in cash, changed his identity, and lived freely for over half a century? A man whose own daughter never knew his true name until he lay dying in a hospital bed. This isn't just another bank robbery story. This is the tale of Theodore Conrad, a 20-year-old bank teller who pulled off one of the most successful heists in American history, inspired by his favorite movie. And unlike most criminals who get caught within days or weeks, Conrad managed to build an entirely new life, raising a family who never suspected their beloved father was one of America's most wanted fugitives. But before we dive into how this ordinary bank teller pulled off an extraordinary escape, let's get to know the man behind one of the longest manhunts in U.S. history. The year was 1969. Neil Armstrong had just walked on the moon, the Vietnam War was raging on, and in Cleveland, Ohio, a young man named Theodore John Conrad was plotting something big. Born in Denver, Colorado, Ted seemed like your typical all-American kid. He was bright, with an IQ of 135, popular enough to be elected to student council, and had a promising future ahead of him. But beneath that clean-cut exterior, something else was brewing. You see, Ted had become obsessed with the 1968 film, The Thomas Crown Affair, starring Steve McQueen as a millionaire businessman who orchestrates a bank robbery just for the thrill of it. Friends would later tell investigators that Ted watched the movie more than half a dozen times, studying every detail, every move. In early 1969, Conrad landed a job at Society National Bank in Cleveland. He worked in the cash vault as a teller, packaging money to be delivered to various branches around town. It was a position of trust, and to all appearances, Conrad was the perfect employee. But as he would later reveal in a letter to his girlfriend, he had other plans in mind. You see, Ted had noticed something about the bank's security, or rather the lack of it. There were no cameras watching the vault. No one checked the teller's bags as they left for the day. And most importantly, no one would check the vault again until Monday morning. On Friday, July 11, 1969, Ted Conrad arrived at work just like any other day. He chatted with colleagues, handled his usual duties, and even took a break to buy a bottle of whiskey and some cigarettes. But as the day wound down, he put his plan into action. With careful, deliberate movements, he stuffed $215,000 in cash, equivalent to $1.7 million today, into a paper bag and simply walked out the door. By the time anyone noticed the money was missing on Monday morning, Conrad was long gone. He had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a baffled group of colleagues and a mystery that would perplex investigators for decades. The initial investigation hit one dead end after another. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw anything suspicious, and no clear trail to follow. Conrad had never been fingerprinted as part of his employment, making identification even harder. The only real clues were two letters he sent to his girlfriend, one from Washington, D.C., and another from Los Angeles, expressing his regret and love for her. One person who couldn't let the case go was Deputy U.S. Marshal John K. Elliott. Something about Conrad's brazen heist and subsequent disappearing act captured his imagination. He would spend the rest of his career chasing leads across the country, following tips that took him from Hawaii to Texas, from Oregon to the East Coast. But while Elliott was hunting for his phantom bank robber, Ted Conrad was building a new life. He had chosen the name Thomas Randall and settled in the Boston suburbs. Ironically, the very city where his beloved Thomas Crown affair had been filmed. He became a golf pro at a local country club, later transitioning to selling luxury cars. He married, had a daughter named Ashley, and by all accounts, was a model citizen. For decades, Thomas Randall was the perfect father and husband. He showed up at every one of his daughter Ashley's soccer games, usually wearing his signature khaki pants and baseball cap. He donated to local police charities and even spent hours watching crime shows like NCIS with his family, perhaps finding some dark humor in watching fictional detectives while real ones continued their futile search for him. But time has a way of catching up with everyone. And in March 2021, as Thomas Randall lay in a hospital bed after his first chemotherapy session for lung cancer, he finally decided to share his secret with his daughter. What happened next would shake Ashley's world to its core, leading her down a rabbit hole of shocking discoveries about the man she thought she knew. But that's just the beginning of this incredible story. While Ted Conrad was living his new life as Thomas Randall, raising a family and selling luxury cars in Massachusetts, investigators hadn't given up their search. The case had become something of an obsession for U.S. Marshal John Elliott, who would pass this burning curiosity on to his son, Peter Elliott, creating a unique father-son legacy in pursuit of America's most elusive bank robber. But let's go back to that hospital room in March 2021, where Thomas Randall was about to shatter his daughter's world with 4 simple words: "I need to confess." Ashley Randall sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand after his first chemotherapy session. She had no idea that what she was about to hear would send her on a journey into a past her father had buried decades ago. With labored breath, he made her promise not to look into what he was about to tell her. But as we all know, some promises are impossible to keep. I'm alone in my childhood bedroom and I Googled Ted Conrad missing, and the first thing that came up said something like, "Vault teller robs bank." I was like, oh my God, this is my dad, Ashley would later tell reporters. What she discovered that night was staggering. Hundreds of articles about her father, wanted posters with his young face, episodes of America's Most Wanted, and unsolved mysteries featuring his case. The man who had driven her to soccer practice, who had chaperoned her school trips, who had lived such an seemingly ordinary life, was actually one of America's most wanted fugitives. But the signs had been there all along, subtle hints that only made sense in retrospect. Though he was clean-shaven in his wanted photos, Thomas Randall always wore a beard and rarely took off his baseball cap in public. He refused to travel overseas, even when his wife and daughter begged him to join them on a trip to France. He always said there were so many interesting things to see in the United States, Ashley recalled. He didn't need to leave the country. Now she understood why. He couldn't risk trying to get a passport with his false identity. The morning after her father's confession, Ashley knew she had to tell her mother. Imagine finding out that the man you'd been married to for 40 years wasn't who you thought he was. As her mother scrolled through article after article about Ted Conrad, all she could say was, "Oh my God," over and over for 10 minutes straight. But here's where the story takes an even more incredible turn. While Ashley and her mother were grappling with this earth-shattering revelation, trying to reconcile the loving husband and father they knew with the young man who had pulled off one of Cleveland's biggest bank heists, fate was about to play its final hand. You see, Thomas Randall passed away from lung cancer in May 2021, just 2 months after his confession. His family had decided to wait a year before alerting authorities, wanting time to mourn the man they knew before his secret became public. But sometimes the truth has its own timeline. Someone, and to this day we don't know who, sent Thomas Randall's obituary to a crime reporter in Ohio. And that's when all the pieces started falling into place. U.S. Marshal Peter Elliott, who had inherited the case from his father, noticed something peculiar in the obituary. Thomas Randall's birth date was listed as July 10, 1947, exactly 2 years off from Ted Conrad's real birth date of July 10, 1949. The parents' names matched too, Edward and Ruthabeth. Even more telling, his mother's maiden name was listed as Kruger, the same as Conrad's mother. But the most remarkable connection? Thomas Randall had filed for bankruptcy in Boston in 2014. When investigators compared the handwriting on those bankruptcy documents with a college application Ted Conrad had filled out in the 1960s, they were virtually identical. The man who had eluded capture for 52 years, who had built a new life and kept his secret until his dying breath, had finally been found. But not through high-tech forensics or dogged detective work, through an obituary that contained just enough truth to connect his two lives. For John Elliott, who had spent decades chasing Ted Conrad's ghost, there would be no satisfaction in solving the case. He passed away in March 2020, never knowing that the fugitive he'd pursued for so long had been living a quiet life in Massachusetts, selling cars and playing golf. But his son Peter had finally brought closure to one of America's longest-running manhunts. What does justice mean when the criminal has already passed away? When the man who committed the crime has spent 50 years living an honest life, raising a family, and becoming a respected member of his community? These are the questions that lingered after Ted Conrad's true identity was finally revealed. For Ashley Randall, the revelation of her father's secret life launched her on a journey of discovery that would eventually lead her to create a podcast, Smokescreen, My Fugitive Dad. Through her research, she began to uncover layers of her father she never knew existed, like the fact that he was fluent in French, something she only learned from his old friends, despite struggling with French homework as a kid. I wanted the world to know who my dad was, and I also wanted to learn about Ted Conrad, the bank robber, and Tom Randall, my dad, Ashley explained. I wanted to know, where do they overlap? The story of Ted Conrad raises fascinating questions about identity and redemption. After all, this wasn't a man who continued a life of crime. After that one spectacular theft, he seemed to have put his criminal past behind him entirely. He even donated to police charities and developed friendly relationships with local law enforcement, perhaps finding some ironic amusement in befriending the very people who might have arrested him if they'd known his true identity. But not everyone sees Conrad's story as one of redemption. Peter Elliott, the U.S. Marshal who finally solved the case his father had pursued for decades, has a different perspective. His father, John Elliott, had missed countless family events, including his son's baseball games, while chasing leads across the country. As a federal officer, it would have taken John Elliott years to legally earn the amount Conrad stole in a single day. Some people portrayed Conrad as a Robin Hood, and my dad called him nothing but a thief, Peter Elliott would later say. When U.S. Marshals finally showed up at the Randall home in November 2021, they assured Ashley and her mother they wouldn't face any charges for not immediately reporting Ted's confession. After all, what purpose would it serve? The man they knew as Thomas Randall was already gone, taking with him many of the answers about his spectacular heist and subsequent life on the run. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story isn't the crime itself, but how Ted Conrad managed to compartmentalize his two lives so completely. He was a loving father who never missed his daughter's soccer games, yet he was also a fugitive who appeared on America's Most Wanted. He was a successful car salesman who donated to police charities, yet he was also the subject of one of the longest manhunts in U.S. history. For Ashley, reconciling these two versions of her father has been a complex journey. The name Randall, which she once considered changing after learning it wasn't real, remains on her birth certificate, a permanent reminder of both the lie and the life her father built from it. In the end, Ted Conrad pulled off something far more impressive than just stealing $215,000. He managed to create a new identity so convincing that even his closest family members never suspected the truth. He built a life filled with love, respect, and genuine connections, all while carrying the weight of his secret. Was Ted Conrad a criminal who got away with it? A young man who made a mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to be better? Or something in between? The answer, like the man himself, might be more complex than we can imagine. And now, for our final case, let's uncover the truth. They say time heals all wounds. But for the guards at Verna Prison in Dorset, England, one wound has remained open for nearly 7 decades. The night a young Irish prisoner pulled off what would become the longest successful prison escape in world history. The date was December 22, 1955. As the winter darkness settled over the imposing Victorian prison perched on the Isle of Portland, 22-year-old John Patrick Hannon was about to make history. Using nothing more than knotted bedsheets and raw determination, he scaled the prison walls and vanished into the night. But here's the truly remarkable part. He's never been caught. Not after weeks, not after years, not even after decades. To put this feat into perspective, Hannon has now been on the run for over 69 years. He's outlasted some of history's most notorious fugitives, far surpassing the 32-year run of great train robber Ronnie Biggs, or even the previous record holder Leonard Fristow, who managed 45 years and 11 months before being turned in by his own son. But who was this man who pulled off what many consider the most successful prison escape of all time? And how did a seemingly ordinary car thief manage to evade capture for so long that he earned himself a place in the record books? Well, before we dive into the incredible details of his escape and disappearance, let's get to know the man who would become the world's most elusive fugitive. Born in 1933 in Ireland, John Patrick Hannon's early life remains largely shrouded in mystery. Like many young Irish men of his generation, he eventually made his way to England, likely in search of work and opportunities. But somewhere along the way, Hannon found himself on the wrong side of the law. In November 1955, Hannon stood in the dock at London's famous Old Bailey courthouse. The charges against him might seem relatively minor by today's standards, stealing a car and assaulting 2 police officers. But in post-war Britain, these were serious offenses. The judge handed down a sentence of 21 months imprisonment, and Hannon was transferred to HM Prison, the Verne. The Verne wasn't your typical prison. Built in the 1840s as part of a massive coastal defense system, it sat atop the imposing cliffs of the Isle of Portland, connected to mainland Dorset by only a narrow causeway. With its thick stone walls and dramatic clifftop location, it seemed like the perfect place to hold prisoners securely. But Hannon had other plans. Just 30 days into his sentence, he found an unlikely ally in fellow inmate Gwyneth Thomas. Together, they hatched what seemed like an absurdly simple escape plan, one that would rely more on audacity than sophistication. On that cold December night, as most of the prison slept, Hannon and Thomas put their plan into action. Using bedsheets they had carefully knotted together, they prepared to attempt something that seemed almost impossible, scaling the prison's formidable walls. What happened next would kick off one of the most extensive manhunts in British history and begin a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The two men made it over the wall, but their troubles were far from over. They were now on an island, wearing prison clothes, in the middle of winter, with police certainly not far behind. Their first stop? A nearby petrol station where they broke in and stole overcoats, beer, and cigarettes, essential supplies for their bid for freedom. But this is where our story takes its first dramatic turn. The pair was spotted by a lorry driver, and within just 16 hours, Gwyneth Thomas was back in custody. He was found near the town of Dorchester, having barely made it off the aisle. But Hannon? He seemed to have vanished into thin air. The police response was massive. Roadblocks were set up across Dorset. Tracker dogs were brought in to follow his scent. Every possible escape route was covered. But somehow, Hannon had slipped through their net. The initial theory was simple. Hannon must have made it back to Ireland. It seemed logical. He was Irish, he knew the country, and he would have connections there. But if that was true, how did he manage to cross the Irish Sea while every port and station was being watched? As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the mystery only deepened. Despite his description being circulated widely, 5 feet 7 inches tall, brown hair, blue eyes, and what was described as a proportionate build, not a single confirmed sighting was ever reported. But perhaps the most intriguing part of this story isn't just how Hannon escaped. It's what happened, or rather didn't happen, in the years that followed. Because unlike most prison escapees, Hannon didn't just disappear for a few years until the heat died down. He didn't get caught in another crime. He didn't flee to some exotic location only to be eventually tracked down. He just vanished. As we approach the 70th anniversary of his escape, John Patrick Hannon's disappearance has taken on an almost mythical quality. If he's still alive, he'd be 90 years old now. His original 21-month sentence would have been completed before the Beatles released their first single. He's been on the run longer than most police officers have been alive. In fact, Hannon's escape was so successful that in 1998, Dorset police did something unprecedented. They issued a direct appeal to him in their force newsletter. "If you read this, Mr. Hannon, please write in. We'd love to hear from you." But the silence continued. So what happened to John Patrick Hannon? How did a young car thief pull off what might be the most successful prison escape in history? And why, after all these years, has no one ever been able to find him? John Patrick Hannon's escape set off one of the largest manhunts in British history. But to understand how he managed to evade capture for so long, we need to look at both what the authorities did right and what they might have missed. Let's start with those crucial first 48 hours after the escape. While his fellow escapee Gwyneth Thomas was quickly apprehended, Hannon seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to stay one step ahead of the police. But was it luck, careful planning, or something else entirely? The manhunt itself was impressive for the time. Police set up roadblocks across Dorset, brought in tracker dogs, and alerted every port and railway station in southern England. Remember, this was 1955. No CCTV, no mobile phones, no instant communications, just good old-fashioned police work. The dogs initially picked up Hannon's scent near the Portland Naval Base, following the railway line that connected the isle to the mainland. But then something interesting happened. The trail went cold. It was as if Hannon had simply disappeared. This is where our first major theory comes into play. Some investigators believed Hannon might have managed to stow away on a naval vessel. It would explain why the dogs lost his scent, and how he could have escaped the dragnet that law enforcement had set up across the region. But there's a problem with this theory. The naval base had tight security, even by 1950s standards. And more importantly, Most ships weren't heading to Ireland, Hannon's suspected destination. So how did he make it across the Irish Sea? Well, this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. In the days following Hannon's escape, police received reports of a man matching his description working as a kitchen helper on a cargo ship in Liverpool. By the time they investigated, the ship had already sailed. Destination, Dublin. Was this Hannon? The timing certainly fits, and it would explain how he managed to slip through the police net. But if this was true, it suggests something even more remarkable, that Hannon had help. Former Detective Inspector Robert Mills, who reviewed the case in the 1980s, explains, "What many people don't realize is that in the 1950s, there was an extensive network of Irish workers across Britain. If Hannon had connections to this community, they could have helped him make his way to Liverpool, provided him with clothes, money, even false papers." This theory gained more credence in the 1970s when British authorities received intelligence suggesting Hannon had indeed made it back to Ireland. But by then, the trail was ice cold. And this is where our story takes another fascinating turn. Because if Hannon did make it to Ireland, he didn't just hide. He seemed to vanish completely. No arrests, no sightings, no paper trail of any kind. In an age before digital records, before computerized databases, it would have been possible for someone to simply disappear. But there's another theory, one that's gained traction in recent years. What if Hannon never made it to Ireland at all? In 2015, British journalist Mark Williams began investigating the case for a documentary. What he discovered was intriguing. There were several unsolved burglaries in the Dorset area in the weeks following Hannon's escape, all bearing striking similarities to his previous crimes. The interesting thing about these burglaries, Williams noted, is that they created a trail heading not towards the ports, but inland, towards London. It's possible everyone was looking in the wrong direction from the very beginning. This theory suggests that while police were focusing their resources on ports and Irish connections, Hannon might have been moving in the opposite direction, eventually losing himself in the anonymity of London's post-war reconstruction boom. But regardless of which theory you believe, one fact remains undisputed. John Patrick Hannon's escape was remarkably successful. So successful, in fact, that it would eventually earn him an unusual distinction. In 2001, Hannon broke the previous world record for the longest escape from custody, 45 years and 11 months, held by American Leonard Fristow. But unlike Fristow, who was eventually turned in by his own son after an argument, Hannon has never been found. This brings us to perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the whole case, the complete lack of closure. Most fugitives eventually make a mistake. They contact family, use their real name, or commit another crime. But not Hannon. Even more intriguing is what happened in 1998, when Dorset police made that unusual public appeal we mentioned earlier. They weren't just trying to solve an old case. They were practically inviting Hannon to contact them. Why would they do this? Well, by 1998, Hannon would have been 65 years old. His original sentence would have been completed decades ago. While he could still technically be charged with escaping lawful custody, many believed the Home Secretary would have granted him a pardon, given the length of time that had passed. But still, there was only silence. As we've seen, John Patrick Hannon's escape from Verne Prison wasn't just successful, it rewrote the record books. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story isn't just how long he's been free, but how his case has influenced modern prison security and fugitive investigations. Today, the walls of Verne Prison still stand tall above the Isle of Portland, though the facility is very different from what Hannon knew. Modern security systems, cameras, and protocols make the kind of escape he pulled off virtually impossible today. But his legacy lives on in every knotted sheet check, every head count, every security audit. Let's take a moment to consider something truly extraordinary about this case. Hannon's time on the run has now outlasted the entire Cold War, the invention of the internet, the rise of mobile phones, the development of DNA testing, and even the complete transformation of modern policing. Which brings us to a fascinating question. If Hannon is still alive today, How has he managed to stay hidden in our modern, highly connected world? Dr. Sarah Matthews, an expert in fugitive psychology, offers an interesting perspective. What makes Hannon's case unique is that he appears to have completely abandoned his old identity. Most fugitives slip up because they try to maintain some connection to their past life. But if Hannon truly started fresh in 1955, creating a completely new identity in an era before computerized records, he could have built an entire life that had no connection to his previous existence. And this brings us to perhaps the most intriguing theory of all. Could Hannon have been hiding in plain sight all these years? Consider this. If he's still alive, Hannon would now be 90 years old. He could be someone's grandfather, a retired shopkeeper, or a quiet neighbor in a small Irish village. He might have married, had children, even grandchildren, none of whom know anything about his past. In fact, this theory gained some credibility in 2010 when a retired Dorset police officer made an interesting revelation. During a review of cold cases in the 1980s, they had received an anonymous letter from Ireland. The writer claimed to know Hannon's whereabouts but said he had built a good life and helped many people. The letter was never authenticated, but it raises a fascinating possibility. Could Hannon have redeemed himself during his decades of freedom? But not everyone believes Hannon is still alive. Former Detective Chief Inspector Thomas Burke, who reviewed the case in 2015, has a different theory. The most likely scenario is that Hannon passed away years ago, living under an assumed name. The reason we've never found him isn't that he's been particularly clever at hiding. It's that we've been looking for the wrong person. This theory would explain the complete lack of leads over the decades. If Hannon died under a different identity, his secret might have died with him. But whether Hannon is alive or not, his case has left an indelible mark on criminal history. It stands as a testament to how different the world was in 1955, and how much harder it would be to pull off such an escape today. Modern fugitive hunters have access to tools that would seem like science fiction to the officers who searched for Hannon in 1955. International databases, biometric scanning, DNA analysis, digital surveillance, social media monitoring, and artificial intelligence. Yet despite all these advances, Hannon's escape remains officially unsolved. His prison photograph still sits in the files of Dorset police, though they stopped actively searching for him decades ago. The case has even earned its own unusual distinction. It can't be added to the Guinness Book of Records until Hannon is either caught or gives himself up. It's a record that exists in a kind of limbo, much like the man himself. As we wrap up this extraordinary story, it's worth reflecting on what it tells us about human nature, about the possibility of redemption, and about how sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved. If Hannon is still alive, he's now lived 3 times as long as a free man as he did before his arrest. His 21-month sentence would have ended in 1957. Instead, he chose a life on the run, a life that, while free, must have been haunted by the constant fear of discovery. Was it worth it? Did he find the peace and redemption suggested by that mysterious letter? Or did he spend his entire life looking over his shoulder, unable to ever truly be himself? These are questions we may never answer. But perhaps that's what makes John Patrick Hannon's story so fascinating. In an age where it seems like every mystery can be solved with enough technology and determination, his case remains a reminder that sometimes people can simply vanish. Before we end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Hannon is still alive? Did he make it to Ireland? Or did he create a new life somewhere else entirely? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most successful prison breaks, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating true crime stories. Thanks for watching.